Dr. Zach Bush is not only a dear personal friend of mine, but he's a triple board certified MD and an extraordinary thinker. Most people, when they listen to Dr. Zach Bush, they say that he is transcendent in the way that he can speak to things. COVID is a very polarizing issue. When people get into this topic, you can start to see the polarization rise. But somehow, Zach can speak to this in a very powerful way, but make you transcendent as compared to polarized in the way that he presents it. He is unique, he's a great soul, a great spirit, and I'm excited to share him with you here right now. Dr. Zach Bush, thanks so much for coming to the studio and sitting for this interview.
What a thrill to be with you.
Well, you're the man of context. I mean, I know that many people who are searching for meaning and trying to understand things are saying, what does Dr. Bush have to say about this? Because there's a lot of stuff flying right now, and context, I think, is needed. But before we maybe get into that part of the conversation, let's talk about your background. So maybe give us the trajectory academically, kind of school, and how you ended up doing what you're doing today.
Yeah, my intellectual pursuits in my teen years were really focused around construction and engineering, and I was really passionate about building things and passionate about innovating in the three-dimensional space, and that was kind of captured my imagination. I was imagining robotics as a field of interest for myself and all of this, and then through a dramatic moment of heartbreak of my first girlfriend, I was so dramatic at 18 that I felt like I needed a year off before entering my engineering program. And at that moment, I was exposed to something radical, which was human life. And I went to the Philippines and was birthing babies with a group of international midwives. And it was such a departure from my entire human experience up until that moment that it just disrupted everything, and disrupted my sense of self, disrupted my sense of who we are, why we're here, what is the trajectory of humanity, because up until that moment I thought we were in control. I thought we were building the future. I thought that our technologies and innovations were going to create this future that we would all want. And in that moment, really recognized that nature has an intelligence within her that we have never even approached in our human innovation space. And we are seeing through the glass darkly, as Scripture says, at our full potential. It's like that Plato cave that we talked about earlier too. We see the shadow puppets of humanity on the wall, and we think that's our reality. And in watching a child emerge from the womb of an impoverished woman in the squats of the Philippines, you can see the brokenness of human systems. You could see the corruption of systems that would lead to this level of poverty, this level of vulnerability in a woman who's abused sexually and then becomes pregnant and then is giving birth without any family support, and it's her sixth baby, and just the layers of tragedy that were layered in here were contrasted with the miracle of life emerging, and the tenacity for life that these babies were demonstrating blew my mind. As a teen, I couldn't even fathom, where's this drive for life coming? Why would a child born in these circumstances have this light within them, this light shining through their eyes that said, I'm here on purpose. I chose this path. Why would you choose that path? What is the deeper wisdom to these souls that would pick this journey? So that was the beginning of my deconstruction of where I thought I was heading. And I really couldn't get out of the medical field after that. I was just like, there's a magic here in this interface between the human experience and life. And then ultimately, went through the journey of thinking ICU medicine and the control to getting into endocrinology and metabolism to kind of find the respect for the cycles of life. What are the systems of communication in the body that coordinate this symphony of life within us, to ultimately my specialty in hospice and palliative care, in recognizing that this most miraculous thing that I had witnessed through, at that point, 17 years in academic training in medicine, was this thing that we called death. And I realized, early on in my ICU years that I was watching something that was not an endpoint, and there was a rebirth happening in these ICUs and in the hospice rooms. And in that, I think that it closes the gate of my trajectory. I thought I was inventing something through innovation and building, to this humility setting in to realize there's a generative factor in nature that's always increasing its intelligence and complexity with every iteration. And I want to be a part of that.
So you've spent time, in the university setting, I guess, in academic medicine, and also private practice. You still practice now, I think, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And now we find ourselves in this kind of bizarro world of COVID and our response to it. So for context, just start with the big picture. How do you see what's going on right now? What's your view on it?
The big picture for medicine is that it's been co-opted by a system of macroeconomics. And so if we look at the U.S. GDP as an example, it's something around $17 trillion a year, something like that. And if you think of what are the biggest sections of that GDP of expenses, where do we put that money? Mm-hmm. And most of us will default to the thought, well, probably our defense budget is the biggest thing. The amount of money we pour into our military, largest military in human history. That's about $680 billion a year. Mm. The healthcare system is approaching $4 trillion a year. So you're 5x, 6x our entire military budget going into this thing that we call healthcare. Yeah. And so what you're watching is now an increasingly leveraged economy in the United States that's becoming more and more unstable for the amount of debt that we generate, relying more and more heavily on the largest economic driver that we have, which is disease management. Mm. And so when you have an economic system that relies on disease as its own driver, you come into this destructive cycle for that society. And if you look past the U.S. boundaries and you realize, wow, that U.S. dollar actually is the foundation for most macroeconomic systems around the world, you start to realize that there's a lot of aligned sense of need and desperate effort to prop up this system, and we need larger and larger scale health crises to justify increasing expenditure in this largest driver. If war is not big enough to stabilize the budget, which we've really proven, the whole push through the 1990s and then the 2000s with all these wars that we started, we were starting to justify large amounts of quantitative easing. It wasn't called that at the time, but we were starting to print money to go to war. Mm-hmm. But the numbers that we could justify through war were too small. And so then we see the big economic crisis of 2008 that then really culminated in 2011, 2012 to a very insecure moment. And the public was kind of blinded from just how vulnerable the U.S. had become suddenly. And it justified $250 billion of quantitative easing, and it seemed like a huge number. But then you look at what we've figured out since then is, wow, if we could demonstrate a health crisis that affected every person on the planet, we could justify many X the number that we had justified in war. And so this new transition from war among peoples to war against invisible enemies. So we went from the war on terror to the war on viruses. And so that transition allowed now for $4 trillion of quantitative easing in the last year. And so it is impossible now, because it's the largest economic driver for the entire global economy, to dissect out something that is reported as a biologic health event and the macroeconomic consequences or opportunities that provides. And so I think it's very important for us to always understand, if we hear a scientific argument or a public health argument, it needs to be understood in the context of the bias of the need for economic driver in this space.
That's actually fascinating as far as drawing the parallels, looking at how war has been used to justify industrial military complex, and now much bigger economy, as you cited, is what's called healthcare, but it's called sick care, disease management. And do you think, from what you're observing, that this is sort of a conscious or volitional thing by groups of people who have power and persuasion to say this is what we need to do? Like, it's a new enemy, as you described. It's a virus. Do you think that there's intention behind it, or how do you see it?
There's always intention behind war. There's been intention behind war since the origin of humanity. And if we look through our history, we repeat it constantly. So you don't have to look very far back to see the patterns in which empire becomes an opportunity. So you have opportunists that rush in to create empire. Mm-hmm. And then as empires grow, they become inherently unstable for a lack of supply chain, right? Mm-hmm. So this is very much a cancer that grows in the human body. Mm-hmm. at the beginning absolutely no threat to the larger system. It's just a 0.0001% of the human body. It's one cell out of 70 trillion that becomes aberrant and disconnected from the greater organism and starts to grow. At some point it starts to outstrip its resources, and it needs to metastasize, and it needs to spread to bring more resources into the mother tumor here. And so the metastases have ways of building lymphatics and blood flow and nervous system supply back to that tumor to bring new resources in. And that's exactly what we do with empire. And so it's always volitional to build empire. It's always volitional to grow empire. And then there becomes this big instability phase where the empire is about to fail, and it justifies extreme measures, right? Well, if the empire fails, it's going to affect millions of households and poverty and war and instability. And so we justify more and more extreme measures towards the ends of empire. And we're at a unique one now. If we look through human history, we're really at the end of a 50,000-year arc here, and we have peoples that we can go and sit down with right now in the rainforest. I was just with a group, the Achuar tribe down there, and you can go to Australia and sit with our Aboriginal brothers and listen to their story, and you can hear 40,000 years of oral tradition played out that really record that 50,000-year arc. And that arc is coming to an end. And so it's not just an American empire that's become fragile. It's a human empire that's become cancerous and is now metastasized across the world. It's outstripped its own supply chains. It has sucked as much resources out as possible to support its current identity or function, which is extractive and destructive. We are at the end of this. And so we have this moment where we're going to see more and more extreme volitional measures to stabilize this system. So is this pandemic volitional? Was it planned? It absolutely had to be, and not down to we need to start this virus. It's more, we need a problem big enough to solve, to unify the world around. And we did that pretty effectively with the war on terror. We were able to create a narrative around 9/11 that didn't really fit what happened at 9/11, but we were able to leverage that moment and say, we're going to create this narrative that would unify the Western world. We found that to stabilize us for another decade, 15 years, but by 2011, 2012, we're starting to see this extreme, fragility of the international thing that was going to require unification beyond the borders of the West. The G8 was no longer big enough to stabilize this, and so we've started making these big shifts towards central banks and centralized monetary policy that's going to stabilize things when the US dollar fails, or as it starts to go into kind of exponential rates of inflation or whatever is going to come next. They're planning for that, and you can see SDR and all these things that have been around for decades suddenly being turned into monetary mechanisms or monetary avenues. And so we are volitionally preparing for the collapse of a 50,000-year epoch, and I think there's people sitting around rooms, military rooms, macrofinance rooms, who are probably well-intentioned in a large part of their awareness that's saying the common person can't possibly understand the complexity of this house of cards, and we need to do extreme measures to buoy this thing up and support it, and we're going to justify any measures because we can see what would happen with this collapse. But what tends to happen in these moments of damage control and all of this is we start to see fewer and fewer people making those decisions, and fewer people commanding the wealth. We doubled the wealth of billionaires over the last 16 months.
You let that sink in.
Let that sink in. We doubled the wealth of billionaires over the last 16 months and plunged more than 150 million new households into poverty. And this is indicative and common of the collapse of empire. And so when you step back and ask, what about the pandemic? What is coronavirus trying to teach us? What is it showing us? We picked that as the enemy, whether we manufactured that in a government lab or we manufactured it through the existential stress that we put on the microorganisms of the planet through our industrial chemical complex, our industrial military complex, our industrial medical complex. All of these are putting extinction level stress on biology on the planet, and the product of that is more and more viral transmutation, because the life is trying to find its way out of this extinction event. So it's creating more and more adaptation capacity, which is exactly what the virome does. And so as we see the virome rise in scale and diversity, and it becomes this existential threat to us, we've mistaken the escape route for the enemy.
Right.
And we're destroying, when we make the virome our enemy, we are destroying our path out. And we are guaranteeing our extinction through this reductionist belief that humanity is separate from nature. And it's stunning to look up Oxford's definition of nature to find out that it says it's all living things, organisms, plants, animals, as opposed to humans.
Whoa, separating us from nature.
Putting us in opposition to it.
Which is the fundamental contradiction that leads us to where we are.
And so here we are. We have put ourselves into the opposition with our very foundation of life, and we have justified it by needing to stabilize human systems that we created out of our sense of scarcity. So it was the scarcity mentality that erupted when we separated ourselves from nature that has necessitated more and more aggressive opposition to that very nature.
So has there been, as you're describing this, and context is really everything, or maybe even perspective more so, because some people have a 10-year perspective, a 2-year perspective, or we can go back and say, we have a 100-year perspective, but then you're kind of backing up to a 50,000-year perspective, and you spot things, as far as behaviors and patterns that say we're at the end of a cycle, and this is where we're at, and it's a pretty disturbing place if you happen to be living at this time in history. But has there been? I mean, what I'm seeing, and maybe what's inferred in what you've just been saying, especially because you started, interestingly enough, with the macroeconomic view, as compared to, well, here's the view of the disease, here's the view of healthcare. Let's look at the macroeconomics first. And there seems to be this sort of insidious enslavement of humans, through spending, through debt, in an unbridled, almost an unbridled way, which has created this predicament that you just laid out and described very clearly. The predicament of saying, wow, we need an enemy to be able to unify because we're close to collapse due to the irresponsible behaviors. And if we're going to spend trillions of dollars and we have all this debt already, we need to somehow enslave people to pay that debt, or to at least support that debt, which it looks like, how sustainable can it be? It might be game over.
It's certainly not sustainable, and we've known that for a long time. I think that it's been a shuffling of the deck chairs, which empire is going to rise, which one will fall. One of my favorite maps that I recently purchased and put on my wall at my office is a histogram of power over the last 4,000 years. And in a color diagram, it demonstrates through the breadth or the narrowing of these color bands the rise and falls of empires. And interestingly, if you look at the very bottom of the chart where we are currently, it's the first time in history there's been so many stripes, there's so many colors. And so on one level, it can look like, oh my gosh, this is the first time we haven't relied on a Byzantine Empire, Roman Empire, a Greek Empire to stabilize the growth of human ingenuity and technology and all of that. We've relied on these single economies of scale to push us forward in our technological and political and socio-political belief systems and experiments that we do. And now we step back and we say, wow, look at how even it's spread. Wow, the United Nations must work really well because it's all spread. But then when you look deeper into the macroeconomics and recognize, wow, what have we seen in these last few years? We see Brexit, we see the British, kind of regime withdrawing from the EU. And the timing of that, just moments before we see this new existential threat of a pandemic and this whole reorganization of wealth on the planet, the whole reorganization of wealth reorganizes those bands at the bottom of the 4,000-year chart into a breadth that is equivalent to the Roman Empire at its peak.
Wow.
And that breadth is when you add Australia, the United States, Canada, the UK, and then all of its kind of subsidiary nation states that are beholden to those currencies as their main macroeconomics. And if you add all those bands up, you realize, wow, with this recent step, the British Empire, in an amazing way, has now stepped in behind all these governments to create these mandates. And what we see happening in Australia right now is an extension of the UK. What we see in Canada right now is an extension of the Crown. And we forget that these countries are still beholden to this single political system of the Crown. In America, we forget this at least. And when I walked in doing business in Ottawa, Canada, a few years back, and I walked into Canadian Health, the Canada Health, which is like the big unified nation state level dictation of what happens in human health. There's a floor-to-ceiling portrait of the Queen, and I was like, where am I? And it was a startling moment, and I was like, wanted to call up all my friends in the U.S. and be like, the British are coming. They're right out. They're just north of our border. We forgot. The British are here. There's this funny sense of like, oh my God, I forgot that macro politics and macroeconomics are still in this colonialism of the British that has been brewing since in their power since the 1700s. And you start to look at this current situation as we needed something this big to stabilize an empire of wealth behind the instability of this now fractured, maybe decentralized power system that has developed over the last 100 years. And so it's time for either the rise of another Roman Empire to conquest and enslave more of us so that it can extract more, stabilize more, push us next, justify the enslavement of wealth and all of that to enrich fewer people, all of that, or we let the system blow apart. And this is the end of the 50,000-year cycle question, is we can see what would have happened at any other part of history. We can see the power grabs happening right now to try to recreate an empire that's multinational and backed by global central banks and controlled by, you're down to a couple hundred people globally controlling the entire money supply for the world. When that starts to get that narrow, it's pretty obvious we're going to rebirth a big empire, and we're going to have to call it what it is soon, because right now we have all these false names for it, like the United States and Canada and Australia. We have this misperception of division, and we have this misperception of uniqueness to us, when in fact we're falling into the same pattern of humanity, which is let's collect as much wealth as possible to try to control and have dominion over ultimately nature.
Yeah.
And so this is where a pandemic becomes obvious, is it's in our iron grip to try to hold on to nature that she rejects us completely. And we start to see this collapse of human physiology. The concept of the human immune system is antiquated. There is no human immune system. The immune system has never sterilized the human bloodstream, has never maintained military boundaries at our borders to keep us sterile. The immune system is a description of a complex ecosystem that is working in biologic biodiversity that dwarfs the human cell identity to maintain balance in an ecosystem. That's what immunity is. Are you in balance with your greater ecosystem? If so, you will never see disease. If you become separate from that ecosystem and you start to become, believe that you're going to micromanage this thing that we call human immunity, and you're going to take more garlic and turmeric than anybody else, and you're going to biohack your way to immunity, it can't happen. It doesn't happen in isolation. There is no such thing as human immunity. There's only the immune system's capacity for tuning the symphony of life within you. That's 30 years of science, and it's not making it into the current public narrative around this pandemic at all, right?
Yeah.
And this is reinforcing instead this fear factor of, oh my God, we need to kill everything around us. And so it's so amazing for me to watch United and Delta and Southwest put their emblem next to Clorox now. And so they're bragging that we use Clorox to sterilize this plane before you walk in. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I am walking into an ICU chamber, and the only organisms living in that plane right now are highly drug-resistant, highly, bleach-resistant organisms that I'm about to breathe. That is a highly imbalanced immune system for that ecosystem that we would call an airplane. or an ecosystem that we would call a restaurant or grocery store or place of work, that we've all turned these all into chemical warfare now. And so we've taken this narrative of a pandemic that resulted from our separation from nature to justify further, more extreme measures of chemical warfare against her.
Well, this is, when you and I and my wife Lori, we get together, we spend a lot of time talking about philosophy because philosophical context is highly critical to be able to interpret what's going on and to make rational decisions about how to proceed. And we look at our germ theory, and the philosophy that supports it, and it's obviously highly flawed. Mm-hmm. So I want to talk in a minute about the virome and maybe the context that you're describing, the terrain, the balance, the harmony, et cetera, as compared to go and hide in your basements until we have this magic juice that we're going to inject into you to make it safe to go out again, and how tragically flawed that thought is at all. But here's another thing that I think, based on what you're saying, we're looking at a moment in time, since COVID, let's say, started, and then we find villains. Anthony Fauci. What he's doing and what he's driving, and certainly there's a lot of speculation about his motives, and a lot of aspersions that are cast, and maybe properly so. But it almost presumes that, well, if it wasn't for an Anthony Fauci, things would be normal and fine right now. If I'm interpreting what you're saying correctly, saying these people become necessary players in this epoch right now, but the circumstances are well beyond those individuals. They just sort of arise, and we think that they're the cause, as compared to, it's almost like germs. There's the virus. That's the problem. We have to attack him in order to get back to a healthy and sane world. But if I'm interpreting what you're saying correctly, no, we're still misguided in the way that we're looking at this. Yes, there might be villains, but the way that we point at these villains, we have to look at the bigger picture and say that it's inevitable that these people are going to have to come up and play the roles that they're playing. Am I making sense in interpreting what you're saying?
You're exactly right. And when we think of germ theory and sociopolitics, they behave the same way in our current narrative, because we are reductionist about our belief of both. Mm-hmm. And we have this constant misperception of separateness.
Yeah.
And so we look at an Anthony Fauci and we either cling to him for hope, or we reject him completely and demonize him. And both are related to the same thing, as we think we are separate from the rest of humanity or the nature. And so in our separateness, we look for these differentiators, and we're like, oh, I'm different from him because he believes that and I believe this. Mm-hmm. Not realizing we are the two sides of the same coin. We are inherently strengthening this misguided global narrative, this big macroeconomic, sociopolitical, human, existential, spiritual identity that we've taken on, is all being reinforced by whether you're pro-vax, anti-vax, pro-Fauci, anti-Fauci, love the NIH, trust the CDC, don't trust the CDC, trust G8, don't trust G8, put all your hope in ESG, whatever it is. As soon as you think that you're in a camp somewhere, you're living an illusion. Mm. We are all in a collective thought pool here. And my thought is no different or unique or special than anybody else's thought. We are all part of this ecosystem experience of human consciousness. Mm. And consciousness is not a body of science. Consciousness is not a body of knowledge or wisdom. Consciousness is a lens through which we see the truth. Mm-hmm. And so if we can imagine the entire universe and its fabric, structure, and its incredibly coherent nature, there is no falsehood in nature. Mm-hmm. There is no waste in nature. There is no area that is not on purpose. It is full on. Consciousness, and what we might call human consciousness, is the lens through which we can peer at that. And when you just have a pinpoint, and our consciousness is small, we can easily misinterpret the whole for these tiny little pieces that we can focus on at any given moment. And then we have the tendency to create a human narrative around the little truth that we're seeing. So is there a coronavirus? Yes, and through a tiny little pinhole of consciousness that says we are against viruses, we will create a narrative around how this coronavirus has emerged, how it's attacking people, who's vulnerable, who's not, what it's going to do to us in the future, all these things. If we start to blow that consciousness open, which is just expand the lens and just pay attention to the greater system from which coronavirus is a part of, we start to realize our narrative isn't holding up. And an example of this is just how many viruses are in my bloodstream as I'm sitting here talking to you. All right, so in the air that I breathe, we're around 10 to the 31 viruses.
Wow.
That's 10 million times more than our stars in the entire universe.
Wow.
The viruses I'm breathing. 10 to the 31 different viruses. It's not like 10 to the 31 copies of the same virus. Different viruses. In the same strain, we've got 10 to the 30 viruses in the soil under my feet. We have 10 to the 31 viruses in the ocean water. And so we are literally in a universe of genetic information that is referred to now as the virome. And the virome is not the same as the microbiome. The microbiome are living organisms that are reproducing, and they need to eat fuel and turn that into metabolic function and create detox pathways and all the things that a bacteria or a human will do in its form of life. The virome has no life within it. There is not a single metabolic pathway. There's not a single consumption of fuel. There's no capacity for reproduction. The virome is simply the genetic database of life on Earth. And
Would you explain that a little bit more? Genetic database of life on Earth. What do you mean by that?
So as I sit here, each of my cells is creating genetic information that will be translated from my DNA into this RNA structure that then goes into my cytoplasm of my cell and becomes a protein. And that protein will then go build a human body, some 400,000 different proteins in the human body. And so there's scaffolding proteins and there's enzymes and there's all these pathways of metabolism and detoxification and regenerative capacity, stem cells, all this stuff happening at the cellular level. But every time I go and translate one of those genetic sequences, I also am translating the on-off switches for the genes and the decision-making tools or just decision-making communication around that gene. And I exude those out of my body. And so I am exuding genetic information out of my body right now that's telling everything around me what are the genes that I'm turning on right now. And that's important to you because I might be seeing a threat in my body that hasn't reached you yet. And I can prepare you for that threat by sending out signals. And I can do that from organ system to organ system. My gut sees a new toxin hitting it and it can send signal immediately to the liver, say, this is happening, I'm having to translate these genes right now, prepare for this, upregulate this, so that as soon as that toxin hits, you can clear that. Better increase the tight junctions in the blood-brain barrier so that this toxin doesn't damage the brain and the peripheral nervous system. Better inform the kidneys quickly so that it upregulates translocation of toxin out of the system and detoxes. So we have this coordinated genomic information stream. That's at kind of the organism to organism level. But if we back up to ask, the deeper question of, well, how did the complexity of the human genome occur in the first place? It was through genetic swapping of not RNA, but DNA. And genes were being swapped at the beginning of life on Earth 4 billion years ago by something called horizontal gene transfer, where a single bacteria could bump into another and immediately give any new gene variant that it had come up with to its neighbors. And it's very sharing, and it's very interesting. You contrast this to intellectual property, where we have this idea of, I just thought of this thing and I'm going to hold on to it so hard that I can make sure I make the money from this, and I'm going to scale this thing globally, and I'm going to create all of this wealth around it. In contrast, as soon as new intellectual property at the genetic level is discovered by a bacteria, its immediate sense is, I need to share this with everybody. I need to strengthen the entire ecosystem around me for my own good. Because the stronger this ecosystem is, the more nutrients I'm going to have available to me, the more durability I'm going to have, the more flexibility I'm going to gain because I'm going to get genetic information back too. And so that nature has this constant sharing quality to it that's phenomenal. But there was a limitation to horizontal gene transfers. You could only share with the people right in your environment, bumping into you. The viruses were created as the next kind of iteration of potential of life on Earth because it allowed us to go multidimensional with our communication. Now a bacteria, floating in a pool in South Africa could put a gene into this envelope that had durable qualities that could be aerosolized and be picked up by dust particles and carbon particulate in the atmosphere and literally carried globally. And not only would it be carried globally, it had new receptors around it that would allow it to bond to species beyond itself. And so we could start to go way beyond a bacteria swapping with another, Pseudomonas to Pseudomonas, to suddenly saying Pseudomonas could go to protozoa, protozoa could go to nematode, nematode could go and inform the earthworm, and so you get this swapping of genetic information. And it's always for gain of function. People have been demonizing gain of function labs, and it's kind of hilarious that humans are trying to figure out gain of function because it's been going on for 4 billion years through the virome. Viruses are all gain of function. Organisms all over the world are always sending out new information of try this new genetic sequence.
But
try this new genetic
human beings
sequence.
shouldn't be trying to mess with that process. You should let nature do it, or do you think humans increasing gain of function in a lab?
I think studying it is fascinating. I think that what's lacking is humility.
Yes.
We need to, instead of saying, oh my gosh, I have this new mechanism for gene manipulation called CRISPR, CRISPR is based on the enzyme called Cas9, which is our entire immune interaction point with the virome. So of the 10 to the 31 viruses in the air, I currently have 10 to the 15 in my bloodstream. 10 to the 15 viruses in my bloodstream are staying in constant collaborative function with my genome because of Cas9 sitting at the center of it. Cas9 is an enzyme that reads every new sequence of viral genomic information coming in from the environment in every single cell. Cas9's proofreading and saying, do I want this or do I not? If not, then it has all these mechanisms to pass that to these enzymes that clip it up. And so these are enzymes that are maintaining kind of a disposal. And then suddenly Cas9 sees, oh, here's a gene update that's really going to be helpful to the resilience of this organism. I'm going to go ahead and translate this. And not only am I going to translate it to a protein ultimately, I'm also going to take this and potentially send it back down into the nucleus to be integrated into the human DNA. And update this individual with the ability to pass that DNA on with the next lung cell that's born, and you can create a new genetic update to that organism. And after a few generations of these genes being put into something like lung tissue, it eventually makes its way down into the genes that get passed in our reproduction. And so it takes 3 generations typically to do this translocation of a new gene in my lung becomes a new gene that I would pass on to the lung of my offspring. And so most of our genetic updating is happening epigenetically and in this organism limited to me. But after a few generations, if that's a coherent and consistent message that this is a good gene for my lungs, I'm going to start passing that on to my progeny. And frighteningly, this can go the wrong way. Whereas we start to genetically engineer our food system as we did in the 1990s, and start to expose people to toxins that disrupt their genome, like DDT back in the 1950s, we can track the genetic consequences of that. And what we're going to find out is that in about 2040, 2030, somewhere in that zone, the generations of children that are coming out of the genetic engineering from DDT to Roundup-ready crops is going to start putting the gene mutations that they have developed that are dysfunctional due to the toxicity of our environment into their sperm and into their ovum, into that germline nucleus. And suddenly we are going to see a species that has destroyed itself by genetically engineering out its relationship to nature. And so this is the frightening thing about humans doing gain of function, is we think of it as in a reductionist pathway where we want to stop other things and we want to only support human information. And in that isolationism, we're going to find our own extinction. And so there's huge risk here, massive existential stress, and to the system as well as to our philosophical belief of who are we, why are we here, and how are we going to go. But I still have this intrinsic hope within me that we are so limited in our understanding of the way in which nature does this whole genetic engineering, gain of function, quality of the virome and its greater purpose, that we don't even know our regenerative potential. And so if for a moment we stop and say, you know what, we're not going to genetically engineer to block spike protein viruses. We're going to come to the humble realization that coronavirus has been in the human experience for millennia and has been a part of our generative health. And we're going to start to embrace that and start to ask deeper questions of what health comes from exposure to a spike protein instead of what disease comes from a spike protein. We're going to start to ask that light-filled question of how did life happen? How did we emerge from it? And when we ask those questions from that perspective, we find out that viruses have been critical to the origin of our species, to mammals in general. Over half of the genome of mammals was inserted directly by viruses.
Wow.
The human only has 20,000 genes, and over half, have been inserted directly by viruses. And so that's not, and the rest have been horizontal gene transfer and lots of other reproductive pathways of passing on genetic information, but half were inserted by viruses. And if you look at the genes and the proteins that they make that were inserted by those viruses, they allowed for us to switch from eggs of the reptile and the avian kingdoms into the mammals for live birth. You cannot have a placenta without a retrovirus that updated us with a new gene that would allow for a placenta to form. We would not have the ability for the human sperm to appropriately inseminate an egg by dropping its mitochondrial DNA before inserting its nuclear DNA, but for a viral update that allowed for that sperm to understand how to dump its mitochondrial genome before inserting nuclear DNA. So these are incredibly specific, jumps that happened that allowed for us to go from birth through eggs to live birth. We couldn't have done it without the viruses. And now, so now that we get to ask these questions of, if the virome is not against us, and it was actually the foundation by which adaptation and biodiversification of the planet occurred, what does it mean to put ourselves in conflict with it? What does it mean to put ourselves in opposition to the virome? We are now in conflict with adaptation and biodiversity, which we now know is really the fabric of all of human health. We now know through gut health and genomics and all of the tissues in our bodies that a healthy body is teeming with an organic garden. And so this fear-mongering, reductionist approach of there's humans and there's everything else is putting us in opposition to life within us. And for every step we take away from biodiversity through chemical exposure, antibiotics, the herbicides, pesticides, which is the primary source of antibiotic kind of chemicals in our environment, we are sterilizing the human experience. And in our isolation, we have to live out the second law of thermodynamics, which is pretty profound, and it's never been proved wrong in any system. And what the second law of thermodynamics says is any system in isolation increases its entropy, chaos.
Yeah.
And so what you see happening in the sociopolitical environment, the polarization of human minds and thoughts, and tearing apart of families because are you pro-vax or are you vaxxed or not, it's tearing apart businesses and economic models all over the world. That chaos that you see is the necessary and immediate reaction of physics to the message from our public health officials to isolate. Everybody go home, stay away from each other. Everybody kill everything around you. Make sure you're sterilizing your environment. Isolate the human experience. Humanity will have to express a higher level of chaos for that isolationism. And in that isolationism, we will destroy ourselves, as any cancer will destroy its greater organism and end up dying in its effort for conquest and sequestration of appearance of limited resources. And so this is the cancer of humanity. And yet we have this miracle happen all the time in hospice, which is we have to discharge hospice patients 10% of the time. 1 in every 10 patients that are admitted with less than 6 months to live, and the average in the United States is 3 weeks to live. If you get admitted to the hospital, you're being dead in 3 weeks on average. And yet 10%, 6 months later, 9 months later, a year later, they've resolved their disease. They're coming out of this terminal state. They're rebirthing something completely different, and they have to be discharged from hospice because they've chosen to live. So we're in our hospice moment. We are the metastatic cancer within our own system, and we could go through a miraculous healing if we will reintegrate into the nature that we've divided ourselves from.
So this becomes fascinating because there's multiple dimensions of this. There's call it the biophysics of it, the idea of separation, sterilization, et cetera, which seems to be going enthusiastically in the wrong direction if we want to really solve this problem. And it starts with a premise, right? The premise that viruses are bad, so you want to eradicate them, and that portrays what you described as kind of as an arrogance or a hubris, right? Well, I don't want these things around. They're a threat to me, and I'm going to eliminate them. Not even understanding that you're populated with them on an ongoing basis and reliant on them for your own survival. So that's one aspect of it. Just saying from purely understanding environmental sciences, that's a pretty it's pretty extraordinary that really smart people take that view, and that's the hubris or the arrogance that they show up with. We're very smart, we're very well educated, and we can just go for separating and isolating and sterilization and ride a storm out and think that there'll be we're going to save some lives, as many lives as we can, without consequences on the other side of that. But another part of it is the psychodynamics, right? And when you start to think about what are the implications of creating fear in a human population, I mean, widespread fear that is promulgated, almost that people literally, I think that fear is important and necessary as a solution to a problem, which is incomprehensible to me, but nonetheless, that's what it looks like. And then separating humans from other humans, so that what kind of an effect would that have on individuals and families and the fabric of humanity in general? And then the economic stress, because we look at the spheres, you're saying, hey, here's your healthcare, let's call it your medical autonomy or lack thereof. Then socially, what's going to happen to you if you want to speak up and if you have a different point of view? Look at what's going to happen as far as you being censored. And then, of course, now, what's happened recently, you can't go to work if you don't get vaccinated. So we seem that there's this compulsion aspect to this that we could have the narrow debates on vaccine good, vaccine bad, vaccine safe, vaccine not safe, and quite frankly, from everything I've seen, it's bad, it's not safe, and et cetera. But should somebody want it, maybe they can have access to it. But should people be compelled to do something against their own conscience in the name of the greater good? And from your view, in the way that you just laid it out, you're not getting into those debates or arguments. You're basically taking a step back, looking at a wider context, saying this was inevitable based on where we are at this point in time, that these behaviors would emerge. And but let me ask this, because you talk about potential extinction event, meaning we don't kind of get rational here. This could all go away. And in hospice, you're saying 10% of the time somebody makes a choice and they're walking out. Are you seeing our odds at like 10% right now, saying if maybe we can, there's a 10% chance that humanity can get its act together and take a step back and say, wow, how irrational we're being, and we can make a different choice and we can walk out of this situation. I mean, is that how you're seeing it?
Yeah, I think if you break down the medical model of where are we at from a biologic standpoint, and then understand it in the context of the macroeconomics of cancer, So once a tumor takes over 99% of the resources for the body that it's in, the body's done.
Right.
Your chance of survival 1% or less, right? Because 99% of the resources are being put into the cancer. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that that's exactly where we're at from a socioeconomic standpoint, is we have 99% of the wealth being controlled by the 1% of humans. Mm-hmm. And so our extractive, destructive economy is at its endpoint. You can't extract any more wealth out of the slavery that we've created through mortgages and through prison system and through the disease model. We've maximized extraction. So why is the Fed printing $4 trillion? It's because there's no more to squeeze out of the lemon. It's empty, and so we're doing quantitative easing. We're creating money out of nothing because...
Which in essence, incidentally, if I could say, they're saying there's nothing left to squeeze with the existing populace, so we're going to print the money and try and squeeze it out of the future populace, which hasn't even been born yet, right? I mean, that's kind of a little bit of the logic.
Yeah, or what's typically seen with war, conquest, these things, is that there's for empire building, you have to empower the masses. You need to inspire them to create a bunch of stuff, and so they build infrastructure. And so you can look at Italy in the 1930s, which is a huge, massive depression. You can look at Germany in a huge, massive depression coming out of World War I. And those two countries had these individuals rise. You've got Mussolini, you've got Hitler, and these individuals arise not because of who they were, but because the terrain demanded their presence.
Yes.
The terrain of desperate human beings without a unifying philosophy of their own on how they were going to retain life and opportunity towards life, were happy to hand off all of that power to an individual who had a vision that they could follow. And that's where we're at today, is we have a massive global depression unfolding. And some people are aware of it, some people are in complete denial, but there is a massive depression. The biggest poverty event in history is unfolding right in front of us. And there's going to be this tendency to raise a couple of individuals that come out with a vision and say, we'll protect you. And if those individuals behave as they need to do, they're going to inspire the masses to go create a bunch more stuff. And so we'll mow down the Amazon and create more factory farms, and we'll build bigger cities in China, and we'll build new big cities in North Saudi Arabia, and we'll control nature so that we can start to extract nutrients deeper from soil systems that in the Antarctic or up in the tundra that's been so far untouched. We're going to find more ways to extract and mobilize this. Once the extraction has reached its full potential, then they collapse the system to get all of that wealth from all of the masses into the few hands. And so we are in one of those cycles now of collapse. So when you fight a war, you send out all this economic growth, and then in the decades or two after the war, you get to collapse the system through economic, monetary policy, such that there's depression, recession, and there's monetary instability. And then you let the whole populace go into debt. And then, the biggest debtor becomes the federal government or whatever it is, because they can start to leverage, invisible wealth and build more and more wealth around them, extract more and more, and then they go into exponential inflation so that the debt shrinks. It's the only thing that can get debt to shrink when you don't have enough money to pay it off. You just go through inflation, and suddenly, the $90 trillion of debt becomes really payable because it costs $5 trillion to buy a loaf of bread. Right. So for 5 loaves of bread, you can pay off your national debt. So we're going through one of those cycles of we built great wealth through the economic expansion of the tech boom and the information technology environment, and we did that globally. Now we collapse that whole thing, and the few people become wealthy, and that creates desperation in the public, and it helps us rise some other dictator to power, and we give more power away so that they will stabilize the system. So these are the cycles we're in over and over again. And so are we going to go extinct? The answer is yes, if we keep doing that. And what is the likelihood of avoiding extinction? Probably 1% or less if we keep in that behavior. But excitingly, this recent pandemic has shown a change of mindset in a very large percentage of the population. And so I get excited when the powers that be in any empire start to overstep their presumed power, and they start to lose control of the narrative. And we've never seen in my lifetime a more extreme, desperate effort to control the narrative through widespread censorship and suppression of any sort of scientific debate around this. Is just pull their medical licenses, close down their medical journals, strip their funding. Like anybody who steps out of the common narrative here is being crushed. And on one side, you can say, oh my God, that's horrible. It means that we're at the end of all things. And the other side of you is like, Yeah, but every time they do that, we get the narrative starts to fail because humans innately know what freedom feels like. And frankly, so does a bacteria. If you try to coerce a bacteria or kill it, it will immediately work to come around the threat. And nature has been brilliant in its ability to create 10,000 different pathways around that antibiotic that you're giving to kill that bacteria. And it will do that by sharing its genetic information with its neighbors while it dies, and then its neighbors will rebirth it. You know, it's that resilient. It's that far-reaching.
Right.
You challenge me, I'm going to give everything I have out to nature so that it can return to me again in a new iteration of self. It's this ultimate empiric capacity for freedom that is being lived out by the microbiome, by the virome, and ultimately by every organism on the earth. Those organisms that are going extinct, one species every 20 minutes now, blinking out. In those last few minutes of life, they're passing all their genetic information out as new possibility and say, okay, as a triceratops, I may never walk this earth again, but I'm going to send out a new possibility. I am going to share in a co-creative imagination of birds. I am the fern dying at the moment of this great extinction 60 million years ago, and I'm going to give up a new possibility by misspelling and creating new interpretations of my own genomics to imagine a flowering plant. And the ferns did that. We got deciduous trees, and we got the meadow flowers, and that inhabit these mountains around us in Park City. And it's just like there's so much beauty because in its death throes, nature said we could do it better. And the moment that extinction was happening, life was created more abundantly. The fabric of our makeup is that we are going to have to participate in that. In the next iteration of life, whether it be humans changing our behavior and being discharged from hospice, or a new intelligent life on this earth. Imagine what replaces a butterfly? What's more beautiful than a blue morpho? Imagine what's more self-aware than humans. That will happen. Yeah. It's coming on this planet. There's a higher intelligence going to unfold. And as a selfish being, I kind of want to see it. I want to be in it. I want to play in that sandbox. Yeah. I want to be co-creating with Mother Nature. Yeah. And I know we can do it right now. I know that through all of this existential threat and everything else, we could suddenly see our self-identity anew.
Do you think that's happening? Because in line with what you were just saying about the censorship and the narrative, et cetera, do you see a virtue saying, hey, it's forced the issue and it's going to create a rebellion that maybe becomes a renaissance for humanity because they've overstepped, when I say they, these forces and these people have overstepped with their arrogance, thinking that they can control the masses, control the narrative, and they miscalculated the quest for truth and freedom that lies in the souls of all humans. So do you see that that's maybe the positive and necessary outcome that this COVID world possesses?
It's almost inevitable, right? That in some parallel universe, this is going to work, And I really believe that if we can dream it, it's happening somewhere in the multiverse, right? Yeah. And we can dream this. We can see a civilization of humanity reintegrate all of its thought processes, sociopolitical policies, all of its intellectual, intuitive, innovations back into nature's template. And we could become co-creators in it. It's beyond a dream. We actually know the mechanisms by which we would participate. I mentioned Cas9 earlier, this little enzyme that is the entire database of decision-making. Do you take on this viral DNA or do you reject it? The scientific pair of scientists that discovered that, in 2015, Dr. Duano, she gave a TED talk on her and her partner who discovered Cas9, and she said in 2016 in a TED talk, Cas9 is the equivalent of a vaccine card.
Yeah, I saw that.
And so would she have been able to say that in 2020? No, but she won the Nobel Prize in 2020 for discovering Cas9. But in an insidious way, the Nobel Prize was given for Cas9 because it became the cornerstone of CRISPR genetic engineering, where we would go and tinker with things like RNA, vaccines or whatever we're going to call them. And so our very moment, this holy of holies that we discovered in how do we actually stay in balance with a virome, we gave the big award, we gave that big Nobel Prize for showing how it could be co-opted and owned and manipulated by human interaction. And in so doing, we stole the power of the discovery. If we back up, so you asked, is this possible? And I said, yes, we can dream it, and I can show you the mechanisms by which we will start to chart our co-creative capacity. When we start to learn that we can support Cas9 in its intelligence, and we could actually accelerate our input of genomic sequences in there to figure out how does humanity actually reverse the germline mutations that are now brewing in our sperm right now, that are going to pass on germline mutations that will be the end of our species, 2030, 2050, somewhere in that zone. We start passing on germline mutations that are not escapable by our current understanding of biology. Cas9, and understanding how it could be the interface to a new genetic intelligence within humanity, we could solve for that. We could let nature solve for the crisis we've created if we put Cas9 on an elevated, hallowed ground of investigation to say, how can we help you, Cas9, instead of how can we exploit you, Cas9. And so the mechanisms by which we will dream that new reality, by which we will create that new reality, are sitting right before us. We can genetically sequence every organ, and we can see the message again and again. Biodiversity creates liver health, brain health, prostate health. Every organ system is about biodiversity in the organic garden. Beautiful. How do we create birthing rooms that immediately introduce that child to the most diverse microbiome possible? Well, that birthing room is going to look a hell of a lot like an organic garden. And we're going to stop birthing in sterile, ICU type buildings. We're going to start to well, what would that schoolyard look like if that child needs maximum biodiversity? And what will be the thoughts of that child when they have so much genetic information at their disposal, at the fingertips of their neural system? They are sensing not human input, but viral input. Not just viral input, but the input of the breath of nature itself. What thought will that child have? And what expanse can we expand that lens of consciousness to, so that it can see the scope of the beauty that we are born within on Mother Earth, sitting in this distant galaxy within the scale of the universe? We are sitting in an energetic moment in this great universe. It's been prophesied that we are one of the chakra centers in the universe. And if we choose to step up and expand that lens, open up the aperture to understand the truth of what it means to be given life in this galaxy, on this planet, we will stabilize not just our planet, but the universe. And so that's an interesting prophecy. And maybe the more concrete one is that of the Achuar people, who have been dreaming this moment in human history for 40,000 years, and have predicted it down to really a decade in which this will happen. Starting in 2012, moving to 2022, humanity is going to go through a transformation because it's going to open up its second wing. The bird of humanity has been flying in circles, doing the same thing over and over again in a downward spiral since its origin, because we only had the masculine wing unfurled. Starting in 2012, we will unfurl the feminine wing. And for the first time in human history, the Achuar people see us flying straight. And when the bird of humanity flies straight, we will leave behind the cycles of slavery, violence, conquest, ownership. And we will start a new epoch of 50,000 years that the bird flies straight into a future of co-creation where it participates in adaptation and biodiversity. And it will dwarf any version of beauty that you and I can imagine in our minds right now. It will be so sentiently stimulating to be alive in 1,000,000 years. In the next 50,000, we will see an explosion of life on Earth if we fly straight and we break the cycles of empire build and collapse, wealth accumulation and greed. When we break those cycles and fly straight, we will go. And so what does the feminine wing look like? What is that going to look like? It means we're going to move from this goal-oriented masculine mind, kill the virus, to a process-oriented mindset. The feminine archetype is a process-oriented mindset where it says, what process will we put in play in which humans are never in conflict with a virus? That's the journey we're now on. And so I'm excited to see that wing unfurl. And it will certainly look a lot like the elevation of women on this planet. We will elevate the feminine voice. We will elevate the feminine consciousness, and that broader lens that's natural to the feminine, the ability to multitask and see ourselves in the context of nurture, back and forth, receiving as much as we're giving, receiving instead of stealing, And so this feminine archetype is going to have to emerge not from just the women on the planet, but for every man, woman, and child is going to have the opportunity to embrace a balance between the process-oriented and the goal-oriented, and we could fly straight and create something that right now you and I can't imagine.
So I think people know when they're hearing truth. And if someone watching you right now and listening to this and saying, wow, I have a deep innate sense that this is true, the question would come up, well, what role can I play in this? I mean, what you're saying is very empowering because it feels like tyrannical powers are taking over. We're being oppressed, all of which is true. And I feel sort of helpless, and I have fear, and I've got my family to protect, et cetera. But then we get to this context of saying this is, a inflection point that we just happen to be born into, and we can imagine now how this might create a great awakening. The second wing unfolds, and now we soar into a new future that, the potential and the vision of that is exhilarating. Now the question is, what role can I play in this, though? Here I am, in this. So what if somebody were to come to you anywhere, that would say, I heard this, I agree, what's my role? What would you say?
I would say the first thing that we have to do is give up the male response to that question, which is, I need to fix the problem. And so that masculine mind is like, oh my God, how are we going to fix this? How can I help fix this? And so that masculine mindset that is all of humanity right now needs to surrender, and we need to realize, oh my gosh, we are each ancient souls. We have a spirit within us that we could call spirit or soul, or we're just energy. We have an energy within us that has recycled in life trillions of times in the epochs of universe collapsing and expanding, collapsing, expanding. How many times has the universe done that? And so in this expansion of the universe that we're currently in, you showed up right now on purpose, not in your human mind, but in your deep energetic soul. You showed up on purpose. And so the first thing we have to do is surrender to a deeper knowingness that we showed up on purpose, and we showed up with clear identity within that greater context of the universe, life, whatever we want to call it. So we have a knowingness in us. And so what is your role in this tipping point of human history? You already know it. It needs to be unburied. And the beginning point that we could perhaps point to right now in a poignant fashion, given the pandemic, is you need to let go of your fear of death, and you need to get into the exuberance of life. Start to make strides towards being exuberant in your fact that you are alive. You are alive right now. Mercy, that's beautiful. That is so miraculous that you showed up right now at the tipping point of all things. 200,000 years of human history. You're here now on purpose. Silent the human mind, that masculine mind, that there's problems and bad guys and good guys. No, there's humanity, which is a terminal cancer. How do we remember the original math of life? How do we vibrate to life instead of fear of death? We chase fear of death in any position that you take, in opposition or promulgating anything, we'll see the demise of our species. If we let go of the fear of death, and we start to embrace the experience of being alive, sentient, and listen within, this access point to the lens of consciousness into the greater knowingness of the universe happens deep in our biology. We have a neurologic center that can take up our mind and our thought. We have seemingly an energetic center somewhere in our chest that emanates emotional signaling and sensing. And down here we have knowingness of who we are, why we came, and what we're here to do. And scripture of any religious background speaks to this. You read the English version, it always says the heart, the heart of God or the heart of man. But that word in the Greek or the Hebrew is always the gut. And so what the real heart of being alive is known is right here. And so start to have the discipline to come out of your mind and head south. But don't stop at the emotional center, because this is a complete disaster right now. And so move past the emotional epicenter into the knowingness field and start to know what it feels like to be alive. I guarantee you have been disconnected from this just as the Oxford Dictionary has disconnected you from nature. You have forgotten what it feels like to have feet, because the last time you paid attention to your toes was maybe when you were 4 running across a field of wildflowers for the last time, and now you've been in Nikes ever since. You haven't touched Mother Earth and felt her exuberance of life under your feet. And so we need to tie back into this childlike experience of being alive and realizing we have no responsibility in the human mind or human intellect to solve for our crises. The crises was that we began to trust in those things. And we thought that we had a responsibility. We thought that we had ownership. We thought that we had dominion over this earth. It's when we find out that we were called to stewardship and that we were called into relationship with this nature. And the beauty of relationship when it is holy and when it is free is that it is never dogmatic. It is never controlling. It is always an opening. It is always an invitation to the soul. And so we need to answer that invitation. We need to step up and we need to be coherent with the original vibration of life in the bacterium, in the nematode, in the soil systems, in the air we breathe, in the life I can give to others. There is an opportunity for us to co-create, integrate, coordinate, become coherent again.
That's beautiful. The philosopher Ayn Rand, in Atlas Shrugged, when she wrote that, to portray her philosophy, one of the protagonists of the story is asked a question: what's the most depraved type of individual that exists on Earth? When you think murderer, pedophile, rapist, and the response was, they said the man, but I'll say the person without a purpose. And I think that's what you're talking about here, is acknowledgement of being alive, and then having a purpose in that life is what
animates us.
It's the animation of the experience and the fulfillment of the potential, right? So this is just a beautiful view of the possibilities that rather shrink in darkness and fear of what's going on right now, and then further lament about how things used to be. Because I think a lot of people are under an illusion that prior to COVID, things were just fine. And look what happened. Life was great, and now life has become this, and things weren't fine. This was, in your description, this was an inevitability and a necessary one, because if we could wake up, and that's the whole thing, we're asleep at the wheel, but if we can now literally wake up, then the possibilities for the future become very exciting.
Yeah. And I want to just encourage everybody in that moment as they start to kind of reimagine connecting to some deep known purpose, that you need to embrace the journey into that experience. And your experience is going to be dominated by the experience of friction. So as you start to quiet the mind and you start to slow down compared to the common narrative and the march of this human machine, the tumor and its growth and the cancer that spreads, as you become different from that, it's going to create an enormous amount of friction around you. And there's going to be this tendency to say, oh, well, now I'm in pain, or now I have less economic power, or now I have this or that because the friction around me is tearing energy off of me. That experience is necessary at the beginning of the journey. And the increase in friction is going to guide you on the path. So relax into the friction. Yeah. Celebrate the pain. Celebrate the discomfort that's going to naturally happen when you let go of the machine and start to float in a different flow. And as you start to float in a different flow, you're literally going to reverse directions, because right now you are in opposition to nature in your consumerism, in your psychology, in your spirituality. You are against nature. As you let go of that momentum of humanity and you surrender to the greater stream of life in the universe and on this planet, you're going to be swept up. And there's going to be rocks in the way, and there's going to be boundaries that you're going to be bumping into, and the friction will become extreme at moments. Acknowledge it and know that it's not anything but temporary, and it's just a redirect to show you back into the flow state. Don't grab onto that rock and suddenly make your identity, I am in pain. No, you're experiencing pain momentarily, but don't make it your identity. And this is the danger of being an activist. As soon as you become an activist against something, you have to cling to that thing so that you continue to maintain your identity of being against that thing. In this very moment, we all feel this need to do something, to reject the common paradigm. Let go of the common paradigm. Just release. It's a surrender, not a battle. Surrender to the machine and let it continue on its path. Because what it was hoping is that you would cling on and donate your slave-like labor to its momentum. The moment you let go, it takes no effort. It's the opposite of effort. It takes a resignation. It takes a surrender, a freeing moment. You're going to start going the other way, and there's going to be frictions. But this time, the forward momentum of all the powers that be, the empire builders and the wealth extractors, have no control over you because the frictions that are occurring are nature interacting with you and moving you into the current that it intended for you originally. And a beautiful thing starts to emerge is that it turns out there's other water molecules going that way, and you're going to start bumping into those, and you're going to have community that is so beautiful and is so in line with not just you, but our natural state, so in line with the mechanisms by which infinite energy gets tapped into. There is no such thing of scarcity in nature. And when you let the scarcity mindset and the scarcity machine move forward, it will distance itself from you further every day. And you will want less, and you will need less, and you will experience more, and you will receive more, and you will weep for the simplicity of life and the realization of how much you are loved to be here right now at the tipping point of all things, how valuable you must be to be selected, to be one that would surrender the control and become part of something greater than yourself.
I'm just taking a moment to let that all just settle in. I don't think anything more could be said. You said it beautifully, and I so appreciate you showing up here and expressing in the way that you do, in the way that you just did. And I know it's going to make a difference, in the right kind of a difference in people's lives. So appreciate you, and so appreciate how you showed up here and your willingness to be vulnerable, transparent, and share your view of things.
I'm so grateful for the opportunity. That's the way we exercise self, and you gave me a great opportunity. And so thank you for each of you listening, for being a part of that. You are the matrix. You are the fabric of everything, and you just let me play in that fabric for a moment. You let me jump into your sandbox and ruffle things up for a moment. I'm just grateful for that. That takes a resource that is most precious in the human linear experience, which is time. So thank you for the time spent. Thank you for the expertise around us in this room that makes this storytelling and this technology possible to reach out and connect in a spiritual fashion that reaches beyond the lenses of these cameras, beyond the awareness of you and I, and we become this ultra force. We become this interpretation of the knowledge field of the world through our shared consciousness, and it wouldn't happen without the community. And so I'm thrilled to be a very small and massive part of it.
All at once. Thank you, Zach. That completes my interview with Dr. Zach Bush. Again, the word that comes to mind, transcendent. Amazing human being, a great spirit, someone that we can listen to and learn from and have a better life as a result.